So I've watched quite a few of Dr. William Lane Craig's debates and lectures recently, as well as various criticisms against his arguments from atheists, mainly against his arguments for the existence of God. And I'm going to try and come up with a few arguments and a few various objections which I haven't heard mentioned in any of his debates or by any objections that I've on any of the videos that I've seen here on YouTube. Now, I actually quite like the neatness of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which is the argument for the existence of God, which William Lane Craig, well, it's his favourite argument, basically, for the existence of God. And, as I said, there's been lots of different arguments against it. Most of them, in my opinion, don't really refute any of the premises of the argument that Dr. Craig sets out. And Dr. Craig himself has tackled the vast majority of these objections in other debates and in his papers that he's released and things. Now, these particular objections that I'm going to be mentioning, for the most part, stand somewhat independent of each other. So don't take the combination of these arguments to be an argument in itself, if you understand what I mean. Now, with that in mind, the Kalam Cosmological Argument is, if you don't know, it is as follows. So premise one, everything that begins to exist has a cause. So first off, I think it's good to say that the wording of this first premise, I believe, is written with God in mind. I mean, we know through experience that everything that begins to exist has has a material cause. We've never observed anything begin to exist from an immaterial cause. So if Dr. Craig was to say that everything that begins to exist has a material cause, then that premise would not allow God to be the immaterial efficient cause of the universe. That's why premise one of the argument states that everything has a cause rather than everything that begins to exist has a cause rather than everything that begins to exist has a material cause. And so he does this to kind of allow God into the argument. So I think it's a bit sneaky, really, to say that everything that begins to exist has a cause, because that's not technically true. Everything that begins to exist has a material cause. So yeah. Now, Dr. Craig states that one of the ways we know premise one to be true is through intuition. But surely we cannot base our knowledge of causality solely based on intuition, as intuition itself is derived from our need to find patterns and connections in the world. And so in this sense, it is necessary for us to possess intuition. But this doesn't mean that our intuition is correct, as it can be easily shown that our intuitions about something can ultimately be wrong. For example, we could make intuitive decisions based on flawed information, or we could be emotionally biased, or not consider alternatives because a particular intuitive solution has worked for us in the past. And also our experience itself provides the basis for our intuition, and we could all have very different experiences. And also, I think David Hume's problem of induction shows us that just because we have observed causal events, there's nothing intrinsic that shows that they must always be the case. Now, I know that Hume doesn't deny the existence of causal relations, but he simply sets out to show how logically we cannot derive cause and effect as a definitive universal principle. Now, indeed, Dr. Craig does show that there are basic assumptions that we make about the world. He suggests that that our memory, we assume that our memory is accurate and reliable. We assume that objective reality outside of our minds actually exists. We assume that our senses aren't deceiving us. Things like this. These are like basic philosophical assumptions that we all have to make. And based from this, why can we not then conclude that perhaps our knowledge and understanding of cause and effect could also be one of these basic assumptions, which could ultimately prove to be incorrect? This seems to be something that Dr. Craig kind of just takes at face value. He assumes obviously that it's through intuition that it's something that is objectively true, and that it could not possibly be just a kind of basic assumption that we make. Now, also, quantum mechanics has shown us that our perception of reality can defy common sense understanding, and the vast majority of scientists believe that time and space itself started at the Big Bang, at the singularity of the Big Bang, 13.7 billion years ago. And so, since time and space itself started at the moment of the Big Bang, it is somewhat nonsensical to then describe the universe as standing in causal relations in space-time. If the universe was created, then there must have been a specific moment when it was created, yet there was no space for these causal relations to exist. So cause and effect as we know it didn't exist before the Big Bang. And so to try and describe the beginning of the universe using any type of cause is surely erroneous, if cause and effect did not exist prior to the universe. And from this point of view, it can also be seen that time and space itself are properties of the universe, because time and space only exist when the universe exists. And so time and space itself are properties of the universe. So if the universe as an entity, rather than, that concludes somewhat that the universe as an entity cannot be bound by space and time, because space and time are properties of the universe, if that follows, if that made any sense. And so it could simply be that how something can come into existence from seemingly nothing is simply beyond our comprehension, because we have this innate instinctive knowledge of cause and effect. And so to say that something can come into being without a cause would defy our common sense, in the same way that the conclusions of quantum mechanics can defy our common sense. Now note here that when I mean that we have an innate belief in cause and effect, this is the belief that we have to see patterns in the world. I'm not suggesting that cause and effect is necessarily an objectively true principle. Now, if we accept the idea that everything must objectively have a cause as we understand it, then scientists have to show how the universe is eternal in the past, i.e. how it never began to exist, how it never came into existence, because it has always existed. And the evidence shows that the universe started from nothing in the Big Bang, and that time and space as we know it began to exist in this particular moment. Now, Dr. Craig uses the evidence pointing to a singularity, this Big Bang evidence, to show that the universe must have had a definite beginning, thus affirming premise 2 of the Kalam argument. So even if we assume that the universe must then have had a cause before the Big Bang, disregarding what I said before about causal relations not existing before the Big Bang, then scientists have to show how the universe itself came into existence from nothing. Now there are numerous and many hypotheses and theories which scientists use to try and explain this. So certain models in physics, such as M theory, loop quantum gravity models, quantum fluctuation models, oscillating universe models, the many worlds interpretation, and quite a few others. Now, Dr. Craig will argue that he argues against these scientific models, and states that most of them, even if true, would still require an initial cause, an initial first cause, further back in time. And so he argues that these theories won't ever actually sort of prove anything, because all they'll do is show that the universe began to exist. Now, I mean, I'm not really going to, go into these questionable scientific theories and try and, prove that Dr. Craig was wrong, or that Dr. Craig's understanding of these arguments are wrong, or anything like that. I'm not going to do anything like that. But as I was alluding to before, this is where our understanding of cause and effect breaks down. As when there's no universe, there's no cause and effect, so we can't describe the beginning of these events in terms of cause and effect. And also, these theories are only, they're relatively new. They're only in their infancy, and so in 100 years' time, we could have overwhelming evidence that one of these particular theories is true, thus discrediting the Kalam's second premise. And as I said before, our intuitive understandings have been shown on numerous occasions to be flipped upside down by the conclusions we draw from quantum mechanics and quantum physics, which defy all reason and all experience and completely defies our common sense. So I think to draw the conclusion that the universe, or everything that is, ever was and ever will be, must have a first cause, is to believe that our intuition and experience of the world must be extremely accurate. Whereas, as I said, quantum mechanics has shown that our perceptions can be very misleading, and that the truth can be sometimes completely irrational and completely illogical. Now, another point that William Craig argues is that real infinities cannot exist, therefore the universe cannot be eternal in the past. Thus, the universe never began to exist. This is basically half of Immanuel Kant's argument in his first antinomy, which Dr. Craig is kind of repackaging. Kant's argument basically states that it's illogical that time must have had a beginning, because if time had no beginning, then an infinity must have elapsed up to our present moment, which is a contradiction, because infinity by its very definition cannot be completed by successive synthesis, or by the adding each successive moment, if you're following. So you could divide each of these moments an infinite number of times, between 2 points, and yet completing this addition itself would occur at some point if time is infinite. And so this is basically Dr. Craig's argument against there being an eternal past. Yet Dr. Craig fails to mention Kant's own antithesis to this problem, or antithesis to this problem, which is also logically true, and that is that time had no beginning. Because if time had a beginning, then there must have been no time, or empty time, out of which time then came into existence. And since necessarily no time elapses in this void where time doesn't exist, nothing, including time, can then come into being, can then come into existence. Thus, Kant's arguments, both of his arguments, show that there is logical proofs for time being both eternal in the past and time having a beginning, which is a contradiction. And this then necessarily renders the whole question of whether the universe or time had a beginning completely meaningless, and something which simply cannot be answered, because it's a logical contradiction. So I believe that this argument, as well as my other arguments, that trying to understand the cause of the universe in terms of cause and effect is essentially meaningless or faulty. And it isn't really a question that can be solved using the limits of our current understandings and the way that our rational minds think. And so what caused the beginning of the universe is quite an absurd question to ask, because our understanding of the world is based on causality and space-time, and before the beginning of the universe there was neither. There was no causality, there was no space-time. So I think this leaves the Kalam argument a kind of a meaningless argument that simply cannot be refuted or proven at this time, and perhaps never will be. And perhaps this is why the argument has been around for so long, simply because it is an argument that can be proven in some ways logically, yet disproven in other ways logically. And so the only conclusion I think that we can draw from this is that it's the question of sort of where did the universe come from, how did the universe begin to exist, is a meaningless question that just has no authority, that just has no meaning